Chris, the U.S. is in a difficult time now, the sense of large transition underway here and economic challenges. That leads this country and its political life to look, as Steve suggests, for, for enemies abroad. It happens with any country, it happens with ours. How should the United States look at China? If you could speak to the American public and think in terms of challenge, but also opportunity. How do you describe it to the public that's going to vote in our politicians?
That's an interesting challenge. I think if you look at this from the point of view of the business community, there are enormous opportunities ahead of us in terms of what we can do in China, and there has been a great deal done in the last 10 years, particularly. When China entered the World Trade Organization, we agreed to that accession in the hope that we would have greater market access within the Chinese economy. They had already substantial market access to our economy. We wanted the same in return, and we got it. If you look back to the 1990s, most multinationals had very small businesses in China which could be called hobbies. They invested $5 or $10 million and they were kind of learning the ropes, and it was a rounding error in terms of their global business. Today, that's not true. Procter & Gamble has a business in China with billions of dollars of revenue and top market share positions in a number of products. And the same thing could be said of many other sectors. The Chinese market today has reached a scale and a sophistication such that if you want to be a global leader, you must be in that market and you must be successful strategically, and many, many companies are. In 2004, Jack Smith, who was then chairman of General Motors, made a speech defending their investment in China against critics who said they would never make any money, and the whole thing was a terrible mistake. And he said, we're in China because our economists tell us that by 2030, China will be the largest automobile market in the world. China became the largest automobile market in 2010. So they were exactly 20 years off in that prediction. There has been a fairly consistent experience of underestimating both the growth and the profitability and the degree to which the Chinese market has been developing in sophistication. So that's all to the good, and we see much more coming. I mean, we took a look at what might happen over the next 30 years, and we think it's entirely realistic to think in terms of taking U.S. exports to China up to $1 trillion a year. And we think it's entirely realistic to think of U.S. enterprises in China having revenues of $1 trillion a year. We think it would be entirely realistic to have Chinese foreign direct investment cumulatively over the next 30 years amount to $1 trillion, even though this $25 million steel investment in the South was so attacked in the U.S. Congress. The potential is there, and current operating conditions are very good. When we look at what the future market access might be, there are definitely Chinese policies trying to encourage the transformation of the Chinese economy to be more driven by domestic demand, less by exports, more by innovation, and less by using other people's technology. Those things, of course, are good, but if you try to get there by closing markets and stifling competition, it will be a failure and it will lead to trade friction. So we have serious concerns about the current direction of Chinese policy, at the same time as we recognize the enormous potential. So you have to make that kind of an argument for engagement and discussion and trying to figure out what the mutually beneficial relationship is going to be. In 2 years, China will change its leadership cadre, and because of the peculiarities of the Chinese system, one, there will be nobody parachuting in from the outside. They all come up from long histories within the party. And two, the entire current generation retires at once, so the average age of the entire leadership drops by 10 years. If you look at that cadre of people, then you have a group which doesn't have the same kind of experiences that Steve is referring to that led the present leadership to be extremely cautious about China's prospects. you have a group of people, who through most of their lives have experienced steady economic growth and dramatic improvements in military capacity and standard of living and all kinds of things. And I think it is a notably more self-confident group than the group that's presently in power. What that self-confidence turns into is, is an interesting question, and I don't know how that one will turn out. So in that sense, I think there's a very strong basis on which to continue to work together, and I'm sure we will be trying to manage this relationship. But I would say we're heading into a period of increasing trade tension and increasing political tension, where the relationship over the next, say, 5 years is going to be very challenging for both sides.
Our time is short, but Steve, let me read you something that Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao wrote in 2007. He's seen it as a kind of liberal in the leadership. And here's what he wrote. He said, "Science, democracy, rule of law, freedom, and human rights are not unique to capitalism, but are values commonly pursued by mankind over a long period of history." Do you think those values will be championed in China in this century? Which ones?
About 4 weeks ago in Shenzhen, where he was speaking at the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the formation of the Special Economic Zone in Shenzhen, he gave a similar speech where he talked about if we do not move forward, I can't quote it precisely, but if we do not move forward with political reform, we are on the road to perdition. Our economic advancements will be reversed. And this is someone, Chris just pointed out, who's got 2 years left in his term, who visited us. We hosted him last week at a dinner where he also spoke about the need for political reform.
Who's he speaking to when he says that? Who's he trying to persuade?
He is persuading, number one, he's talking to us. He's talking to a U.S. audience, which is very receptive to that message.
Eats it up, I think is the phrase.
And he is talking to the Chinese people. The speech was covered rather sparsely in the initial period immediately after the speech, and then was covered by the state-run media universally after a few days, not dissimilar to when Deng Xiaoping made his trip down south many years ago and started a new process of economic reform. There is clearly debate about what it means. Their view of universal values and our view of universal values are always going to be different, but are they moving in the direction of legal reform, political reform, social reform? Absolutely they are. When I compare it to when I first moved there in 1979 to today, it is an entirely different society. And often when we're critical, we lose sight of the fact that there has been this enormous progress. What did Martin Luther King say? The arc of social justice bends slowly. I mean, it's a slow process, and we need to accept. It's hard for our political system to accept that it doesn't occur in a year. But has there been this progress? Is it a different place from where we lived in 1979? Absolutely. Are there bumps in this road? Absolutely. Should we continue to advocate for change? Absolutely. But should we keep the historical perspective? Yes.
Steve, wrapping up, your sense of the importance of an organization like this organization, with its history, with its deep connections and roots in China, in this great relationship?
It's critical. And the one thing I would ask of all the fellows who are here, because you've all experienced China firsthand, and we've talked a lot about a political debate in our society, because you have had this firsthand experience, and most Americans have not. I believe it's incumbent on you as fellows to stand up and speak out in this political debate and talk from firsthand experience.
Chris, your sense of the importance of an organization, small as it may be, like Yale-China, in a relationship this large?
I think what this organization and what all of us gain from being part of it is a broad sense of perspective and an intense realization of the way in which the way in which China can change, the United States can change, and the relationship can change, that we're not locked into things. And I have that personally. I was speaking to a group of the new fellows at a dinner in Beijing this summer, and I told the story about my orientation, which largely consisted of being invited to lunch by Kenneth Latourette at the faculty club in New Haven.
Yes, yeah.
Uncle
Quite
Ken,
sufficient.
and one of the things I said to them was that Uncle Ken, who was class of 1911 and was one of the first people to go to Changchun, he took us to lunch and told us about his experience, and he seemed extremely ancient. And thinking about this afterwards, I did the mental calculation. I figured at the time he was probably 76 or 77 years old. And now that I'm 67, he doesn't seem quite so ancient as it did when I was 22. But it wasn't just his age. It was the fact that the China he described, where you had this 45-day trip by sea and then up the river to get there, and then you got there, and there weren't a whole lot of foreigners around, but fortunately or unfortunately, there was a British gunboat in the river which was kind of protecting the peace, and you would every now and then, because they were starved for social life, be invited to dinner by the officers' mess of the British gunboat, and so you would dress in your black tie and be rowed out.
Pretty much like now, fellow.
Formal dinner. And we, of course, were going to Hong Kong in a period when China was largely closed to the outside world, pursuing an autochthonous economic strategy which was disastrous, about to fall apart socially, had just been through a famine, and we know from Frank DeCutter's new estimate that there were 45 million people who died in that famine, but that was not known at the time. And to us, it was clear that his world was gone, dead, forgotten in the distant past, and was never going to come back. But in fact, the China that we thought about in 1965 is now also dead, gone, forgotten, will never come back. We've moved on to something else. And so where there's life and change, there is hope. And that's one of the things that Yale-China teaches you.
Terry, the last word goes to you on the importance of this organization in this century, in this great relationship.
As important as it is for Americans to learn about China, it's no less important for Chinese to learn about the United States. And I'm convinced that there is a deficit on the Chinese side. The Chinese have had to be very pragmatic and have focused very intentionally on the policy issues of the day, on current U.S. China relations, trade issues, and so forth. They've become very good at that. But what the America watchers in China say is we don't have an adequate grasp of the underlying values, the underlying issues that really drive and help to explain American society. It may be impossible, Tom, but so I think the role that the American teaching fellows, Yale-China teaching fellows play in explaining these values, in explaining this wild society that we call America is absolutely essential. And I would also hope that someday there might be a counterpart organization that would bring Chinese to the United States to do in reverse what Americans have been doing for a century in China.
That's what Steve does it for.
Yeah, there are such programs.
Someday,
but,
Steve, someday.
But I would hope Yale-China might undertake something like that.
And I would hope the same. We have a very challenging century in front of us. This has been terrific. I'm sorry, too brief, but terrific conversation. And please join me in thanking Terry Louts, Chris Merck, and Stephen Wall.